Well, hey everybody, how are you? We doing good? Welcome to the conclusion of our aTypical series. And before we dive into that, how about helping me give a big welcome, like we've never done it before, to our Eastside family in Park Rapids, Redlands, Bellflower, La Habra, Anaheim, online. It's so exciting to be doing this with all of you together. And today we're wrapping up the aTypical series that I hope and pray has helped us reframe and rethink the financial arena of our lives. And the big idea behind this whole series has been that if you want what typical people have financially, a lot of stress, maxed out credit cards, then just do what typical people do. But if you want what few people have financially, financial peace, then do what few people do and be aTypical. And 2 weeks ago, I began the series doing something very atypical. I handed out money to everybody. Aren't some of you sorry you missed church that weekend? And everybody at Eastside got a $1 bill that weekend in one of these envelopes, just like this. And to be clear, this was not the church's money. This was my money. I went to our bank and I withdrew enough $1 bills for everybody at every Eastside campus to have one. And this was money that we would have used to pay our mortgage and utilities and for Barbara and me to eat on. But I asked you to carry that dollar around with you for a week and then bring it back, or my wife was going to be really upset with me for talking her into this. And so my goal was to help you feel the tension of carrying someone else's money. Because when you carry someone else's money, there's a responsibility that comes with that. And the Bible teaches that everything comes from God. It all belongs to God, so you carry someone else's money every single day. And how you manage your money, how you manage your stuff, your savings, your inheritances, it's a spiritual issue. Now, I have never seen $1 cause so much stress in people's lives. People were like, I feel so uncomfortable carrying your money. Or what if it doesn't all come back? Are you and Barbara going to be okay? Other people thought this was like a test, like the parable of the talents we studied in week 1, where the guy with one bag of gold hid it and buried it in the ground instead of multiplying it. And Jesus called him a wicked and lazy servant. So some people wondered if they were going to if they were supposed to give like $10 back in the envelope and multiply it somehow. For instance, there was one mom and her young son who wrote that they wanted to give this experience to God and see how far they could take my money. And so they took the $2 they got and they bought sugar with it, and they put it with water and lemons they already had, and they set up a lemonade stand in their neighborhood where it not only gave them some joy to their neighbors, but they earned $13 from that. But it gets better. They took that $13 and they bought supplies to make keychains, and those keychains brought me and Barbara $50. So obviously, some of you are really underachievers in this church. I just want you to know. Listen, this was not a trick to get you to give more back. And some of you evidently were worried that everyone wouldn't bring back their dollars, so you put in some extra. You didn't trust the people of Eastside as much as I trust the people of Eastside. But you all really blew me away. Not only did you bring back everything I entrusted to you, but after I took out our money, there was almost an extra $3,000. But so that was awesome. But here's what's cool about that. Our Park Rapids, Minnesota campus is busting at the seams, and they're attempting right now to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars to help them expand their campus. And so Park Rapids, every penny of that extra $3,000 is going to help you with your expansion to reach more people for Jesus and in your community. How cool is that? Now, if you didn't have a chance to return your dollar yet, you were gone last week, you can put it in the container at your campus today that has this handsome picture on it right here. And you'll find this bucket at the exit door of your auditorium, except in Anaheim, you'll find this out at the information desk if you brought that. So every dollar from this point forward is going to go help our Park Rapids expansion on that. Now, today, I've entitled this last installment of the series, aTypical Decision. Atypical decision. And I want to share with you from a very personal level something that God has taught me in my life and what I consider to be the most important and strategic financial decision that I've ever made. To be honest with you, one of the best financial decisions I ever made was I married well. Many years ago, my wife Barbara found herself in a tough financial situation. She was a divorced single mom with no money, no house, no child support payments, zero. But she went to work and she paid her own way through college, and she eventually became a registered nurse. And though times were tough for her and her son Jeremy, she saved and she invested what grew to be a sizable amount of money for a single mom. And she bought a little starter house. And when we were dating, I went with Barbara while she negotiated on a brand new top of the line, fully equipped Toyota Camry with all the bells and whistles on it. And when she got the price that she wanted, she whipped out her checkbook and she wrote a check for the entire amount. And I said to myself right there, I am going to marry that girl someday. Friends, I'm telling you, I married well. That was a great decision, but it was not the most important financial decision I've ever made. I told a few weeks ago, I told you about some of the atypical financial decisions Barbara and I made before we got married. For instance, other than a manageable home mortgage, we decided we would never buy anything that we didn't pay cash for or pay in full when the credit card bill came due at the end of the month. I was 33 years old when we got married, and believe me, I paid my stupid tax for dumb financial decisions in my 20s. Anybody else paid your stupid tax, or maybe paying it right now? When I was in my 20s, I bought and financed new cars every 2 years. Car dealers loved me. I was making payments out the wazoo. I can't believe how much money I wasted just to have that new car smell. So Barbara and I made the atypical decision that we would say we would only buy cars we paid cash for, and instead of making budget-busting car payments or lease payments each month, we would do that. Some of you didn't even know that was legal, so I just wanted to let you in on that. Barbara and I made the atypical decision to save a minimum of 10% of everything we made when we got married. And again, I didn't save in my 20s, paid my stupid tax. I missed the opportunity. Now, I did have a savings account. Of course I had a savings account. There just wasn't anything in it. But all through my 30s and 40s, and now at the tender age of 59, I've been saving a minimum of 10% and often more for over 26 years, preparing for that inevitable day when no church will employ me anymore because I'll just stand up and babble and drool jello out of the corner of my mouth when I speak. Friends, all these decisions have been really important atypical decisions in my life, but they are not the most important financial decision I've ever made. In fact, before I tell you the most important atypical financial decision that I've ever made, I want to unpack a scene for you from Mark chapter 12 in the life of Jesus so that you'll fully understand why I view it as the single most important financial decision I've ever made. And here's the context of what's going on in Mark chapter 12. Jesus is near the end of his life and ministry. He knows he's going to be crucified within days. In fact, he can count the hours now. He's already ridden into Jerusalem on the back of big donkey and little donkey on Palm Sunday, and the whole city was stirred, which we studied last weekend. If you weren't with us, you can go online and you can watch it. And he enters the temple courts for the very last time, and he begins teaching there. And in the midst of his teaching, he gets his disciples together, and he says, hey guys, come with me. I want to show you something. And so Jesus takes his disciples into the temple treasury, which is about the size of a living room. It's about 200 square feet with no roof on it. It's a colonnade with columns all around it. And in this temple treasury room would have been 13 trumpet-shaped receptacles, something like this, so you could drop your giving into the temple. It was like the giving box of the first century. Mark chapter 12, verse 41 sets up the text, and it says, Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put, and he watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. So Jesus is in the temple treasury area. He sits on the wall opposite the offerings. And the word for watched means that he watched with a discerning eye. He was basically telling his disciples, let's people watch here for a bit. Let's watch people give, and we'll just observe how generous they are. And we read then that many rich people threw in large amounts. And you may wonder, well, how did Jesus and his disciples know they were throwing in large amounts? Did they go up to people and say, hey, how much did you put in? Was it a large amount? What was it? Now remember, in that day, they didn't have paper bills like we have today. All they had was gold, silver, bronze, and copper coins. And each one of those coins would have represented a different weight and value. For instance, a gold coin would have had a value of about $350 in our day. A silver coin was a denarius. It was about 1 day's wages. People were giving gifts, and they were giving large gifts because it was the Passover. The Passover was the time when they remembered when the death angel passed over the homes of their ancestors, sparing the life of the firstborn. So thousands of people had poured into Jerusalem, and when they would give their gifts, they would take their offering and they would drop it in the container, and it would have sounded something like this. And you could have heard it. So let's put ourselves in the story. Imagine you're one of the disciples and you're watching people put their gifts in. How would you discern what was considered to be a large or a generous gift? And think about that. What is the amount in your head? For most of us, we have an amount in our head and we say, now that's generous. For instance, maybe if you saw someone drop in $100, you'd be like, that's pretty generous. Or maybe the amount for you would be 1,000, or maybe it's 5,000 or 10,000. Now, based on what we know, here's what like $500 would have sounded like being given. They would hear that. Here's what like $5,000 would have sounded like being given. And here's what like $10,000 would have sounded like being given. $10,001. So for illustration purposes, let's make up an amount like in our minds that would cause most of our eyes to bulge. Picture yourself, you're one of the disciples, and you're watching as someone, based on the sound, let's say, dropped in $10,000, and you say to your buddies, whoa, did you see that? And then somebody comes in and they drop in an amount that is close to $50,000. And you're like, wow, that's unbelievable. And then I think something happened that must have stopped everyone in their tracks. A guy walks in with like a really big bag of coins. And we know from Matthew chapter 6 that sometimes when someone would make a large gift, they'd like make a big public spectacle, a show of it. And so you see this guy coming in, and he's like making this big production about it. Excuse me, like big bag coming through. Can you kind of let me in, crowd? Thank you. Oh, this is so heavy. And it would like if I could get to the front of the line, it would be a big help because this thing is so big. And you watch this guy when he gets to the front and he starts pouring in his offering, and you're just stunned. And it just makes your jaw drop. And it's like going and going and going and going. And he just keeps giving more and more and more. And when he gets all done, you're like, that's like $200,000. And I think most of us would agree, that is a pretty lavish gift. And we just say, wow, that is some big-hearted, open-handed giving right there. Jesus, did you see that? But you look over at Jesus, and he's watching something completely different. We read in verse 42, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a fraction of a penny. Here comes this humble, raggedy-looking woman who gives an offering that would have sounded something like this. 2 mites, the smallest denomination of money in the Roman world. These 2 mites would have been made of the thinnest layer of copper and worth about 1/4 of 1 cent. And I think maybe Peter, because Peter was always putting his foot in his mouth, right? I think Peter probably was going like, that was lame. That's nothing. Why did she even bother? And I think Jesus locked eyes on him and gave him the death stare or the stink eye or whatever it was that Jesus gave. Can you imagine getting the death stare from Jesus? And Jesus uses this widow to teach one of the most important principles you'll ever learn about finances. Don't miss this. Verse 43. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, I tell you the truth. This poor widow has put, now I want everybody to say this word with me. Let's all say it out loud. Has put more into the treasury than all the others. And I think maybe Matthew, who was a tax collector, like raised his hand at that point and said, excuse me, Lord, kind of like Columbo, like, excuse me, Lord, I was a tax collector. And in order to do that, I became a CPA, and I took advanced calculus. And Jesus, I know we've been sitting here for a while, and maybe you got sidetracked, and you missed a lot of what was happening over here as people were bringing their gifts. But I was calculating, and I don't know if I told you, but I'm really good with numbers. And I hate to correct you because I know how you hate it when the Pharisees correct you, but I think you may have missed what a few people put in. I mean, I was watching very carefully, and I did the math in my head real quick, and actually, this woman, she put the least amount in of everybody. And I think Jesus looks at Matthew and all of his disciples in a way that only the one who owns it all can. And he says, guys, you completely missed it. All those other people you saw, verse 44, they gave out of their wealth. But she, out of her poverty, put in everything. All she had to live on. You see, here's what Jesus knew, what no one else knew. He not only knew the amounts that everyone gave, he knew the income of every single person that gave. And thus, he knew what percentage of their income that gift represented. Not just the actual amount, but the proportion. And friends, here's the atypical financial principle that Jesus was teaching that day. Don't miss this. God measures generosity based on percentage, not an amount. And we mess this up in our minds all the time because our world gets caught up in amounts. We hear about someone who donates $500,000 to build an orphanage or $1 million to build a building, or the recent graduation speaker at Morehouse College who donates $40 million to pay off the student loan debt of every single graduate. Large amounts are headline news in our world. But listen, they don't hit God's headlines. God's headlines are always dominated by percentages, not by amounts. And we see that all throughout Scripture. Now, here's how this applies to some of you. I know some of you, you don't have a lot. You don't make a lot. You just don't. But you faithfully return the first 10%, your tithe, to God, believing that it belongs to Him and honors Him. And there are probably times you hit that push pay button on your phone, or you set up an amount on eastside.com, or you look at your giving statement and you say something like, oh God, it's such a small amount. What can you even do, God, with such a small amount? And I want you to know, and I want to encourage you, God doesn't ever look at the amount you give, ever. He looks at percentages. Now, on the flip side, there are some of you that have been blessed with a lot of wealth. God has really blessed some of you with the ability to earn a lot of income. And you might feel really good when you donate like a significant amount of dollars. And if others knew how much you gave, they'd be impressed, right? But I'm telling you, God isn't ever impressed with large numbers. There's no amount of zeros that God will ever look at and go, wow, because God's loaded. God owns it all. So He's never going to get impressed with an amount. God is impressed with a percentage because God measures generosity based on a percentage, not an amount. So with all of that as a background, I want to share with you the most important and strategic atypical financial decision I've ever made. And it wasn't a decision I made when I was 50 years old. It wasn't a decision I made when I was 40 or 30 or even 20 years old. But as I look back on my life, I can tell you with absolute confidence and clarity, the single most important and strategic financial atypical decision I ever made was when I was 5 years old. And before you snicker at that, let me tell you my story. My mom and dad were committed followers of Jesus who didn't have a lot, but they understood that God measures generosity based on percentage, not an amount. And my parents were very generous people. When I was 5 years old, I started getting allowance for the first time in my life, and it was big. I thought it was 50 cents per week. Every Friday was payday. I don't want to take too much credit for it. I might have been the person to coin the phrase, "Thank God it's Friday." Just saying. Now, from the first time I got an allowance, my dad sat down with me, and here's a lesson for you parents. Start teaching these principles to your kids when they're young. My dad sat down with me and he said, "Gino," that's what he called me, "Gino, everything we have comes from God. And now that you have an allowance, I hope you'll show God that you're grateful to him by returning the first 10%, what the Bible calls the tithe, to God." That's the word he used. Well, I was 5 years old and I was like, okay, what's 10%? I didn't know. So my dad explains it to me. And he took out 10 nickels. 50 cents. That was my allowance. He said, every time you get 10 nickels, that means that you would honor God by giving at least the first nickel back to him. And then he asked me, "So what do you want to do?" The church that I grew up in had these little cards where we would write down our intention of how much we intended to give in the next year. And my dad had one of those cards for me. I'm 5 years old. He has one of those cards for me. And he said, "You decide, and let's fill this out." And I said, "Dad, I think I want to give God 2 nickels a week." At 5 years old, I was a double tither. That was 54 years ago. And I can't tell you how powerful that single decision has been in my life. From the time I was making 50 cents a week in allowance to the day I started making $2.50 an hour working on a farm when I was 14 years old, to the time I got my first job out of college making $18,000 a year, all the way to today, I've practiced this. My parents taught me that even though I had very little at that time, 50 cents a week, that it really was very big in God's eyes because God measures generosity based on percentage, not an amount. You see, God is looking for sacrifice when you give. That's why King David said, "I will not sacrifice to God that which costs me nothing." God can do more with the sacrificial $50 tithe from a single mom or elderly man on a fixed income than the millionaire who casually tosses in a few $1,000 to get a tax break. Maybe you wonder, well, what about those who say that tithing is an Old Testament thing and it's never mentioned or encouraged in the New Testament? I disagree with that. For instance, Jesus himself said in Matthew 23:23, he said, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth or you give a tithe of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter," notice this, "without neglecting the former." If tithing were no longer a New Testament practice, this would have been the perfect time for Jesus to have said, "Hey, forget all that tithing stuff. That's old covenant. Just give whatever you feel like giving." Or he could have said what he said all throughout the Sermon on the Mount repeatedly in different teachings. He could have said, "You have heard it said, but I tell you," but Jesus didn't say that. Instead of rebuking them for tithing on these spices, he tells them they shouldn't neglect that, nor should they neglect the more important matters of justice, mercy, and faithfulness either. I heard about a woman who called her pastor and she said she needed his help. Her husband had a history of heart problems, and so she had just learned that her husband had inherited $50 million. And she said, "My fear is that when he hears the news, he'll have a heart attack and never get to enjoy it." So she said, "Pastor, could you come over and gently tell him so he doesn't have a heart episode?" And so the pastor goes over to visit him, and the pastor asks him, he says, he says, Joe, what's the most money you ever made in a year? And the man said, a year before I retired, I made $85,000. The pastor continued, let me ask you, what would you do if you inherited $50 million? And Joe says, well, pastor, the first thing I would do would be to give a tithe of the money to our church. And the pastor died of a heart attack. There are many of us at Eastside, not just me, who could tell you they have seen so many blessings in their own lives from honoring God with percentage giving. And Brett and Jacqueline Jackson are some of our young adults here. And here's Brett's own story, and here's his experience in his own words. Take a look.
My wife and I, when we first got married, we were looking for churches. When we went to Eastside the first time, knew this was the place for us to be. Tithing was always not something that was very important to me from early stages of life, just because I don't come from a very well-off background, so giving up 10% was really tough for me. It wasn't until I met my wife to where she actually made that a requirement for me to date her, was to give 10% of my income. And so it was tough, but immediately, like literally within the next couple days after I gave my first tithe, immediately started to see a lot of different things that have come our ways financially from a blessing standpoint. I kept pushing on because I wanted to be obedient, and I wanted to kind of see what God had in store for me if I did trust him. And he came through every single time, never went without. And it's not always like money that is given back, it's blessings in other ways, whether it's your health or your car running a little bit longer than it needs to in between checkups. There's a lot of different ways that the Lord gives back to you. I think it's atypical for people to give back, but a lot of people need to realize like none of it's yours to begin with. It's all the Lord's. And so we're just giving back 10% of what's already his. His entire attention and entire time is dedicated to us. So why can't we give some of our own time? It'll change your life. It truly will. It really is the best thing that you can do for you, not only financially, but spiritually, emotionally, mentally. I think it's roughly 30% of Christians actually give 10%, and we're the largest organization in all of history. So imagine if 100% of Christians gave 10%, what kind of impact it could have in the world.
So imagine what kind of impact it could make in the world if all of us did this and we practiced percentage generosity. Now, I think our assumption is, our fear is that if we give, we may not have enough left over for us. But listen to me, nothing invites God to bless your financial situation like this atypical decision to honor him with the tithe. And I know at this point, this is the point like where people are tempted to think, well, this pastor is just trying to get my money. Listen, if you think that, I genuinely would rather you go to a different church and you trust their leader and you tithe there versus stay here and not try this in your own life because you don't trust me. That's how big a deal this is to me and how much I want you not to miss God's blessing in your life. So I want to give you a moment right now to commit to making an atypical decision, which I believe could be the single most important financial decision of your life, like I made when I was 5 years old. If you come to Eastside, you probably may notice that we never pass offering buckets, and very rarely do we talk about giving. One of the reasons is that the majority of us at Eastside do our giving online or through the mobile app. So while we don't normally pass buckets, we are going to pass buckets today. And if our team at each site wants to go do that right now, and this is not for you to give something today. I'm just gonna tell you, do not put anything in, okay? We're only gonna pass these buckets for you to take something out. And inside these buckets is a card, and if you need a pen to write with, if you don't have something to write with, you can take a pen. And it just says atypical on the back of it. And I want to give you a moment to make a commitment to God. And this is just between you and him. We're not going to collect these, okay? So you don't have to worry like, oh, I've got to turn this in. This is just for you. And here's what these commitments are. Number one, you can check the first box that says, I'm going to finally acknowledge that everything belongs to God, 100%. And do not miss how important this commitment is. It's saying, it's all his. I'm just a manager. It's a spiritual decision. The second commitment would be, if you wanted to make it, is that you're committed to faithfully tithing. And this is about, like, for 70% of us, here's what I know. For 70% of it, this is a commitment that I know you need to make, and it would be a big act of faith for you to do that. Some of you already tithe faithfully, and you have recurring giving set up. You might want to commit, like Barbara and I do, to give above the tithe, generously beyond the tithe. So as you're getting those cards and as you're thinking about that, I just want to challenge you by reminding you what you're investing in. We have 5 campuses right now. And the only reason you can sit in the room that you're sitting in today and the environment that your kids and students enjoy around here is because someone in Eastside's past said, I'm going to open my hands and my heart and I'm going to invest in something beyond myself. I want to show you again something I showed you last weekend if you were with us that God has done in our church as people have invested. This is our attendance growth chart since 2008, and it's staggering. And I don't know of any investment that you can invest in that has this kind of growth rate. And you know what this investment is in? It's in people. This is people. The investment you will see when you get to heaven, laying up treasures in heaven that you invested in, it's people. And in this same time frame, we have baptized over 6,300 people at Eastside campuses in that time frame. Yeah, give God some praise and thanks for that. So the life change is miraculous. But God is not done, and we are not done, and we intend in our future to have a 6th campus and a 7th campus and more. Why? Listen to me, because we are called as a church to reach our towns and cities for Jesus Christ. And what I'm asking is for many of you to step out in faith with us. Because much of what God wants to do in our church is going to be based on many of us making atypical decisions to invest in stuff God cares about and not just stuff that we care about. So I'm just going to challenge you. If you're with your spouse today, do this together. If you're new at Eastside, you're still checking out Jesus, there's no pressure for you, okay? This is for those who call Eastside their church home and say, I love my church. Barbara and I are making the same commitment today. And then keep this card just somewhere where it will inspire you. For me, I'm going to put it in my wallet. It could be for you on a refrigerator or a mirror at the center of a kitchen table. For some of you, I know this is scary because some of you have never really trusted God in this way. And I would just encourage you to try it. And trust God. Try it for 90 days and see if He's not faithful. So I just want to pray right now that whoever you are and whatever you're going through, that God would help you trust Him in an area that's so hard for so many people. Let's bow our heads at every campus. Father, I want to pray right now for people who are making commitments today. I pray for marriages, that you would bind them together and that they would trust you together. I pray for those who are single, who are on a fixed income, and it's really scary to trust you in this way. I pray that you would surprise them with your faithfulness because we know that you will. And God, may we all trust you to greater levels. May we live an atypical life in an area that we need to trust you more in. And God, may we never forget that our generosity is always tethered to a bloodstained cross and that you have given everything for us, including your one and only Son. We are forever grateful, and we lift our prayers to you now in His name and for His sake. And everybody agreed together and said, amen, amen.